Okay, good morning. So we are in Genesis part 5, lesson 2. We are going to be covering Genesis chapter 40 and 41 today, and then also hopefully a short amount of time to spend on the attributes of God that we were asked to look at. That was a bombshell, was it not? Day 5, the very last question, and then she loads us up with probably at least a week's worth of homework to look through. Did anybody actually attempt to get to any of that?
I read it, but there's no way to. 11 pages.
11 pages? Wow, Carol, I'm impressed. Okay, so you can come and teach that part, because what I finally did because it was Saturday night when I got to that last question, and when I realized what she had done there, I almost had a heart attack, for one thing. And all I did was kind of sit there stunned for a moment, and I thought, if I am overwhelmed by that one last piece of work, which is in itself, I know that Precept Ministries has a Bible study on the attributes of God, and I don't know how many weeks it is, something like 9, maybe 12 weeks, somewhere in there. And she just laid on us all these characteristics that we see about God. None of them are specific to Genesis. She didn't go into Genesis and affix them to Genesis so that we could go and look at it. That would have been a quicker, especially if it would have had only been 1 or maybe 2 verses for each one, and they would have been right in Genesis where we're familiar. That would have been very helpful. That would have been effective. But to dump on us Psalms and Deuteronomy and Samuel and Chronicles and all these other places, contexts that we're not as prepared to go into that quickly. I hope all of you, did not kill yourself trying to get through that. I am so sorry. Had I known, I've said this before, this is my first time through these parts of Genesis inductively. I've done part 1 and 2 many, many times, but for whatever reason, I've never gone on to the other 3 parts. So for that reason, I was unaware of this, and I had not gone ahead and looked at that. And oh my goodness, if I had, I would have given a note ahead of time and said, set that aside. And here's what I think I want to do, and I was talking to Susan about it yesterday at Sunday school. I think what I want to do is take that packet that you've already done, Carol, and you can share with us later some of your insights, though, because I would like to hear from what your thoughts were. One student able to be the champion. You have been a star 2 weeks in a row.
Well,
that is amazing.
I wanted it. I thought about, just reading some of these or whatever, but I want it because I can turn back to it.
Right. Absolutely. On paper. See, that's what I do. I copy and paste, and I want to print it out and have those verses. And often they only give you 1 or 2 verses, and I like the fuller context, so I add more in, and that magnifies the problem. Yeah. But yes, I bet there are. And see, because you're not familiar with the context, you're just dropping in. You're going, what? What's going on here, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, but here's my plan with that is I want to take that segment that Kay gave us, because it's priceless. It's wonderful what Kay gave us, but it in of itself is an entire study. So what I think I'll do is, Kristen, if you'll help me remember, because your memory is much better than mine, because you are younger and. But I want to take those and set it aside and pull it out maybe somewhere as a filler. And what we can do is say, okay, do you remember that? We can scan it like you often do. And later, if we have a week that's like a lull and we don't know what to do with it, and we need an extra. Yeah, I know. Actually, we're always the opposite. But it would be nice or we'll plan it to be in there before we start a lesson. Like maybe if we have a week 0 where there's no homework due, I'll prepare that lesson and then teach it or something. But I'll find a way to slip it in.
Just one of the names.
Yeah, or something. I did one of the names today, and I'm going to, if we have time, when we get these others done, I'm going to share it to you from the perspective of Romans chapter 8. And Oh, Romans 9. Sorry, yes, Romans chapter 9. And what I did in Romans 9, I don't know how I found that chapter out of the clear blue, but it hit me when I was reading the list of the attributes, like what you did, Carol. And I saw that one on the sovereignty of God, and immediately I thought of Romans, because Romans is broken down in that way. And that's one of the segment divisions. There's 3 chapters in Romans, 9, 10, and 11, that is on the sovereignty of God. If you didn't know that, it's awesome. And that very first chapter in 9, it uses almost all of our Genesis. Did you love it when you went and read that? I was telling Susan that you'll never read Romans with an emptiness again, because now that we have studied Genesis so thoroughly, when you go to Romans 9 and read that chapter, you're right there. You're like, yep, I know all that, because we studied Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they took all those examples and beyond that as well, which we haven't gotten to, David and all these others, but those ones that were and they were detailed, weren't they? And so it was really fun when I went in there and read that and went, oh my gosh, this just makes and you also see the depth of the concept that is being taught there about the sovereignty. It's not saying what it kind of feels like on the surface if you don't have the backdrop. But because we have the backdrop of Genesis information, we can go into Romans 9 now together and read that and talk about the sovereignty of God and say, oh, there's nuances to what is being said in there. The straightforward first glance, it kind of looks like what they're saying. Well, God has the right to do anything he wants to. But that's not what it's saying at all. And so hopefully we'll get time to go there. All right. No, I know that. And that shocks me too, because Kay is big in the Romans. The Romans one is one of her, anyway, that's one of her biggies. I know she likes.
Mine, and then out of all of these, the one that I really loved was Isaiah 46, 8 to 11, and it was under sovereign.
Okay.
And that was really good.
And what did you?
Well, the parts that really, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me. My purpose will be established. I will accomplish my good pleasure. Truly, I have spoken. Truly, I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. Surely, I will do it.
I will do it. And it's not like, I will do it. It is, I will do it for you because I love you, because I'm a holy God, a righteous God, a God who knows and sees, and I created you for my pleasure, and I want to give you everything good. And I mean, so the idea behind it is, if you know the attributes of God, you're willing to submit to the sovereignty of God, because you know his intention is for your good, right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, now let's go on to Genesis chapter 40. Okay, let's start with that. I'm not going to go back and do a review on our previous chapters at this point, other than to say that what we saw in Genesis 39, and actually even 30, was it 36 or 37? 37, where Joseph is sold into captivity. We saw the backdrop to that storyline was the favoritism that was going on, and then the brothers were not happy with him. And would you say that now, having done chapter 40 and 41, thinking back on that storyline of those brothers and how they treated him and how that all kind of unfolded, where was God in that, do you think?
What man meant for evil, God meant for good.
There you go. Exactly. What man meant for evil, God meant for good. And you're jumping ahead a little bit, but that's exactly correct. And you know, you kind of look at that storyline, you're thinking, well, first of all, God didn't make those boys hate their brother, right? No, we all know that. But what God did do was allow the sinfulness that was going on in that family to just go ahead and brew and ferment and do its thing, so that in the culmination of time then, and remember the progression of that event too was they wanted to kill him initially. They threw him in the pit. They were discussing it. And eventually, Reuben, does not want to kill the brother. I think he's just trying to get back good favor with Dad probably, after his cabustle with the mother, sleeping with the mom, Billa, which is not good. But Judah, of all people, decides, hey, let's just make a buck off this guy. Because lo and behold, what comes by? Oh, you don't think that's divine providence, do you? Yes. And so God sends this caravan in exactly the right time in order that these boys then this greed would stir up, and he said, hey, let's just make some money on this. And they did. They sell him to this caravan, and the caravan then takes him down into Egypt, which is exactly where God needed him to be. But he was there just a tad bit early for the event, right? And in the time, what do you think God was planning for those years prior to that, right? He was probably in the house of Potiphar about how long do you think? Do you have any? Okay, he was at probably about 10 years, because he went down there, he was 17. When he stood before Pharaoh, he was how old? 30. Yeah. So 30 minus 17 is 13 years, correct? So how long was he in the prison? If he was in the Potiphar's house 10 years, he was how long probably in the prison? About 3 years, right? So what is God doing in those 13 years? I mean, it's a guess on that, but what they have done is they've looked at the timing. We know it was a full year after the dream was pronounced, that before he was remembered before Pharaoh. So there's a year. And probably before that was a couple of years. Those men, the baker and the candlestick maker, no, the baker and the cupbearer and the baker were probably in the prison, they said, for some time, probably about a year as a guess, because it had to do with the birthday of the king, remember? So we'll go back and look at that in a minute. But so basically, commentaries kind of say about 3 years is a good guess. Could have been a little bit longer, but right in there.
Sometime, I don't have my paper, but I know that it was the same word for when God created the day.
That's right.
And you're like,
Oh man, it's undecided. You get to pick. Context rules for interpretation, and there is no context to tell us. There's
probably
not.
wasn't too long. I don't think it was actually too long if they were the chief of both, and he didn't replace them yet. So I don't think.
Or maybe there were more than one. Who knows?
I didn't
Yeah.
figure it was like years and years.
No, it wasn't usually years,
like
but
30 days. You're like, that's enough time.
I think it was longer than that. I think that they were there for some time. I think it was longer than a few days, because it didn't seem to indicate a short period of time. And one of the things was he had been there long enough to be ministering to them, and for them to come to.
Took care of them.
In any event, what was God doing then in those 13 years? God's plan was to get him there. There you go, working all things together for good. And once he got him there, though, what was God doing in the life of Joseph? Okay. Developing his character. And what do we know about his age again? How old was he when he got down there? 17. What else was he developing? His brain. Yeah, 17. He's just a kid. Maturity, becoming a man. And we know Potiphar's wife probably, well, who knows? I was going to say, surely she wouldn't be pursuing a 17-year-old, but you never know. You never know. But probably he had to mature a little bit in those years in the house so that he grew to manhood enough. And but maturing him, growing him up to manhood, because at 17 the odds would be pretty less that he would be given that kind of position by Pharaoh, right, at the age of 17. So it's kind of like he got there early. And it wasn't early by God's timing, right? It was just early in his age. So what did God do for 13 years? He grew him up. He matured him. And
grew in his management skills.
Yes.
In his ability to, he probably was learning as he was going.
He was.
How to manage.
He started the prison managing.
Right.
Right,
Guy's like, I don't
exactly.
have to worry about
He
this
had,
and now.
right, so he needed to learn household management first because he probably wasn't doing that necessarily at home, although we saw some indications of good management by the fact that he was tattling on his brothers, as some people call it. I don't call it that now that we know that he was a son of old age. What that really meant was he was mature for his age, that he had wisdom beyond his years, and that his father therefore loved him more than the other brothers because what he saw in him was integrity and hard work and perseverance and all those things. So we saw him when he went to search for his brothers. He went the extra mile. There's probably right where that phrase came from. He went the extra mile, right, to find the brothers in order to fulfill his duty that his father had sent him on. We know that that Joseph was he was I guess he had some things that he needed to mature in, but one of the things I got to thinking about was this thing about the dreams. What do we know about his relationship with the subject of dreams when he was still at home with his brothers? He had a dream twice, right?
He didn't know what they meant.
He didn't know what they meant. But did you remember how many times did he have his dream?
That's right.
Twice, right? And back then he seemed to be kind of clueless about what was going on with it. His dad sure didn't help him, right? Dad was like pondered on it at the end, but after he rebuked him. Crazy. But now, in these two chapters, what we're going to be seeing then is this maturing that he's gone through spiritually also. So he's grown up physically. He's learned life lessons through hard knocks and through work. He is learning to persevere under struggles and difficulties that are not of his own doing, and learning to be content in whatever situation God puts him in. Certainly he didn't like being a slave in the house, but you think you didn't like that? Well, let's try prison, right? Then he moves into the prison. So God is maturing him. He's refining him. He's growing him up. He's giving him skills. He's also testing his character, right? He's testing his resilience and his commitment and faithfulness to God himself. And in all these things, he consistently is showing us. It's not to say that there are not some struggles that he went through in his own heart and privately. You can just bet that he was praying through the whole thing, right? But these are the things that we've seen with Joseph so far. What an amazing story this has been for us, and how much better we understand this man Joseph than we ever did prior to our homework here. So let's go ahead and dig in then. And all we're going to do is outline, because again, Genesis is what kind of literary style? It's a historical record. And what do you do with history? What are the major events that major things that you're looking for when you do historical?
Places and events.
There you go. People, places, and events. So that's what we're looking for. People, places, and events. And in doing that, then we're outlining our paragraphs, and we are simply saying, who are the major characters? And once you determine who the major characters are, and who is the major character in Genesis 40, and well, I guess just we'll start with 40 with Joseph. And
Cupbearer and the baker.
yeah, then they come secondary, right? So they're kind of like support characters to the story about Joseph, right? So you know it's all about Joseph. You're still following that lineage of Joseph. And so it's Joseph. Now you're looking at the events, and people, places, and events. So the places in this case is not geographically on a map, but it's location, right? And he's back in jail. He was in the house, now he's in the dungeon below the house. Okay, so let's look at this, and I'll leave a place up here for the theme so I don't forget to do it, hopefully. Okay. And let's talk about that verse section. First verses in this chapter 1 through 4 give us the setup for what's going on. What did you see in 1 to 4? So what's the storyline there?
Pharaoh imprisons the chief cupbearer and baker with Joseph.
Yeah. Okay, so when you closed out the previous chapter, Joseph had been falsely accused and put in jail. And I had indicated to all of you on your title, you might want to put in jail in the king's prison, because the location of that being specific to the king's prison was an important part of this, because this is where we see now. Now we see the king's cupbearer and the king's baker are now put into that same prison right there with Joseph. So this sets up the cozy relationship of these three major characters. So we have the king's cupbearer.
And I read the cupbearer served as a butler.
Yes, the cupbearer and butler are synonymous, right? Okay, the cupbearer and the baker are put into prison with Joseph.
And in verse 4 where it says he took care of them.
Yes,
Took is sometimes minister.
yes, that's exactly right. So it talked about, let's see, I'm trying to look if I look, oh, I don't have it here, it's in my notes somewhere. But yes, he was ministering to them, the cupbearer, the baker, took care of, to minister, to serve, and to minister to, right?
To me, that's above and beyond.
Yes. Well, it is, and it is, because remember, what had the prison guard done? He had placed Joseph in a position of leadership. He was in charge of them. He was the overseer. So the same thing that had happened to him in the house of Potiphar now has happened again. What does that tell us then about Joseph?
Something special about him.
There is something special about him, and he manages to,
Getting off the trustworthy vibe.
right. So does this make him again a person for good reason to be a favorite? Yeah? And you know, often we are always jealous. You remember being in school and teacher's pet, you know, and it annoyed everybody, right? But why was it a teacher's pet situation usually?
Because they were asking questions.
Yeah.
And helping
And helping and doing their homework and showing up on time and saying, let me erase the board for you, and you know, here's an apple, teacher, right? But it isn't that person is being sucking up, so to speak, as they say, but genuinely interested and wants to be engaged, right? Like all of you, showing up and setting up and doing the things that you do for us. I mean, these are important qualities that people like leaders are looking for in others, because they need that support team, right? And so that's what, in fact, Joseph proved himself to be. He literally proves himself to be, again, at still yet a fairly young age. If he was 17, he might be 27 at this point. He is now proving himself again to be a son of old age. A son of old age. So although, because later they actually say in here he was still a youth, a Hebrew youth was with us in the prison, right? So they still consider him to be a youth, and yet he's considered, as he was said by the father, he is a son of old age. He is a mature young man, okay? All right, the king's cupbearer, 1 to 4. 5 to 8?
The cupbearer and baker have dreams.
Yes, great title. It's nice and crisp, right to the point. Cupbearer and the baker have dreams. Now, what does Joseph tell them regarding these dreams?
Do not interpretations belong to God?
Yes.
That is me, please.
All right. So again, we spoke a moment ago about what is the process. What is God doing in the life of Joseph? What is the reason that God required 13 years of Joseph's life to be spent down there before he elevated him? Besides the language and the customs and learning all those things, what we see here then is there's this maturity that's seeping through the storyline on a regular basis about how he has a faith in God, Yahweh, that he is trusting him, and when given opportunity, he also does what? in this case. What could he have very easily have done in this situation?
Tell it to me, I'll tell
Oh, hey, let me help you out.
He-
I can
He
help you
points
with
to
this.
God who's doing it.
Yes, he gives God the glory,
God can
right?
do it.
God can do
So
it.
Tell me, and we'll see what
Yep.
God has to say.
So, says the cupbearer and the butler have dreams.
Baker.
Oh, Baker, sorry.
B words.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And then, and Joseph, I'm just going to say proclaims, because he gives this statement to them, and I don't know if they know about Yahweh. I'm not
I
sure.
know about gods. It's
They
Egypt.
certainly do know about gods, because we know all about Egypt's polytheism and all the multitudes of gods that they worship there. But he makes a proclamation that interpretations belong to God.
And that God is Elohim.
Thank you. All right. Elohim, which we know is by definition what?
Majestic creator.
He's the creator God, and he's the true God. Now, how profound is that in its defined element in the context of this setting here?
Created your dreams.
Yeah, he created your dreams. And he,
True God that can interpret.
and by saying he's the true God, what is he saying about their other gods? They're not true gods. Yeah, exactly. So he's, in a way, he's literally becoming a little missionary in his world there, right? Now, what was the reaction of the cupbearer and the baker to the dreams that they had had? They were dejected. Now that's a word. There's a big mouthful. Dejected.
Yep, I looked that one up.
Oh, good. I figured somebody would.
2196, and it's and it just says, in a state of having discouragement with a focus, that the feeling has now affected the outward appearance of an object.
Okay, so discouragement, mine said troubled or even sad looking. That would be that outward appearance you're talking about, sad looking. So that when Joseph entered into the room where they were at, he literally looked at them and said, "What's wrong?"
So basically,
Right?
the thing just occurred to me that
He observed
probably
them.
were not happy going into the prison to begin with. So he's obviously been around them long enough now that they have come to
Right.
accept this is where we are and it's okay.
That was my point,
And
yeah.
then all of a sudden now they're like, well, what's wrong now? Because
Right.
we've been
Right.
And typically people who are in charge don't care whether you're happy or not.
No, not in a prison. That's not their concern. Right, exactly. But the idea is he did say, when Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them. So he literally looked at them and saw something. So with this sad lookingness or troubled, you can tell when someone is nervous or anxious. I mean, all you have to do is go into a dental office and look around. Right? You can tell people are not happy to be there. So there was that. Now, he says, now, do not interpretations belong to God? So let's look at that word interpretation, since that one is another key word in our chapter here. And it will be a key word that's going to follow on into 41 as well. And about interpretation, what did you find?
I thought I looked it up and now I can't find it.
Well, it's really pretty obvious. What do you think interpretation means? Just off the
Meaning.
What's the meaning? Oh, see, you didn't even have to look it up. It was that simple.
When you put it up there, I was like, is it a trick question now?
No. It just means to explain it,
I think I did look it up, but I didn't.
meaning.
Because it just didn't.
Sometimes I do that too. I'll write it down like, oh, it means what I think it means.
Why bother? Yeah.
Okay, the meaning is given. That's what interpretation means. So, The reason why, though, you do still want to look things like this up. Here's one of these Precept 101 teaching moments. What have you found in your personal experience thus far with word observations through word studies?
Well, they don't always mean what you think, or they mean way more than what you think.
They can
Like,
mean a couple different things.
Yeah. So, like day or a period of time or some time, you don't know what that means. You get there, you look at the definition, and like there's 3 different possibilities or 4. And you're going, okay, so then once you look at that, then you say, okay, so which one do you choose? If you don't know, it gives you 4 different choices for a definition. Context rules for interpretation. Now, sometimes your context makes it clear. There was evening and there was morning one day. What is a day? It's a 24-hour period. But when you're looking at other places, like we had come up here later, and it just says they were there for some time, right? When they had for some time, where was that word? Is that right here in the beginning? In verse 4. So they were in confinement for some time. Well, some time just was vague. And you had a lot of choices. Again, context rule. It really doesn't make it super clear. All we know are a few clues. Long enough for Joseph to notice their demeanor was off, that when he came in, they were troubled. They were sad or troubled. And so he knew them pretty well. Also, long enough for him to have been given charge over them so that he had this relationship with them and so forth. So knowing the word is sometimes really important if you look it up and learn what it is. Sometimes its context is going to have to be the one that tells you. Other times, like this one, interpretation, it's what you think it means. As long as you understand that word, it is exactly what you thought it was, that interpretations. But there's another word in this that we didn't talk about yet, and that's the word dream. We're talking about dreams, right? They have dreams. So what do we see about dreams in this? We need a definition on this. I think we did this last week. I know we did, but I want to do it again. Because there are 2 different kinds of possibilities. Now let me find my word study on it. Okay, it's 2492. And it can be 2 different things. Number 1, it can be simply a normal dream that you have at sleep time. What do you think the other one is? Yeah, a supernatural God-given dream. So you have 2 possibilities to pick from. And in this case, then, what are you thinking about the dreams that these men have been having? These 2 dreams that they each had.
These were God-given.
They were given by God. Now, how do we determine that that's the case?
Like before we get to the knowing for sure that it's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because they're both get out of these dreams the same night, and they're both feeling awful.
Okay, that's a clue, right? And the fact that Joseph seems to be convinced that he's going to know because God's going to reveal it to him, to me that's an indication that Joseph is through the narrative, we're being told this is a dream that God gave them. And that God's going to reveal to me what he has put in their dream. Okay, all right. So those are just some foundational pieces then of through word study that help to develop your understanding of the narrative on the whole. You now know how come they were sad, or what that sadness was about, how Joseph became intuitive enough to recognize it. I think he literally just saw it upon them. And then the interpretation is something, it's to explain and to give meaning. And what we've learned about this in this case is these kind of interpretations, if it's a dream that's from God, God is the one that gives the interpretation. Now, if it's not a dream from God, what?
It's just your brain doing whatever
It's just a dream, and there is no interpretation. However, what is the problem in our world today with dreams?
Everybody says everything has some kind of.
People go overboard with the dreams. And, we talked just a little bit about this last week. What is the distinction between a dream that is just a dream, and you wake up, you go, oh, that was weird. That was a weird dream. And then about 20 minutes later, you're going, what was that dream? Right? But when it's a dream from God, what?
Well, you're not going to forget it.
You do not forget it.
Like, there's going to be something probably physical about you that, like, you just can't get it out of your head. It's always there. It's really visual. You know everything that happened. You don't, like, have those missing parts. I remember flying, but I don't remember, like.
Right.
It's
No.
crystal clear.
Yeah, and I don't know why I was there, but, it was in my underwear. Right. When it's from God, it is profound enough that it leaves a strong impression to the point that the next day these men are disturbed, perplexed, sad, troubled. And it stays with them. And to the point that then when Joseph shows up later, they can detail their dream blow by blow. They don't forget it. They can tell it. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people who have dreams and they're good at. I have my friend Celeste who has dreams a lot, and she can remember a lot of her dreams and in a lot of detail. But I've never had her say to me, "Oh, and with that anxiety and that perplexed state of anxiousness." Now, I won't say that there's never been a dream that wasn't from God in her life, because there have been. But on the whole, even though she can remember many of her dreams, she's just one of those unusual people. God gives a lot of dreams to her. Most of them are just dreams. I mean, that just come to her. They're not from God. But God has given her dreams. And in those dreams, she's shaken, right? I had a dream many, many years ago. It shook me to the core. And it's probably been 25 years now. I could tell you blow by blow what that dream was about. It was the Lord speaking to me. And in the end of it, what God told me in that is he gave me a ministry call, so to speak, my trumpet blow for my life. That I'm not going to tell you the whole dream. I'm not going to go into all the, it's just too lengthy. But the end of it was this. I was distressed over a calling that I had been asked to come and do some teaching to a congregation of women. It was a very large church. It was in Virginia. And I was terrified. And I'm like, Lord, what do I tell them, right? So that was where this whole scenario set up. What do I tell them? What God said to me at the end of that dream was, you tell them, my word is everything. My word is the only thing. And for me, I knew exactly what that meant. I mean, I can expound on that to umph degrees, what he meant by that. But it was two very clear, very concise statements. And the thing that was profound to me was it followed an earlier calling where God had given me a ministry calling out of the book of Ezekiel, where he says, you tell them whether they want to hear or not. You are responsible for the word that you're given, and you are to preach it, you are to teach it, and you are to tell them whether they like it or whether they don't. Because I think God knew that these days were coming, and his word tells us that these days were coming, right? So I give you all this to say, in context to what we're learning here, this is another, like a secondary teaching that you could go into these segments here on these dreams, and you could talk to the church on the whole about the idea of dreams and have it be a healthy discussion rather than a wacko. Don't put all your baskets into it, because listen, most of 99.9% people don't ever have a dream from God. What God does do is he gives you his written word, and everything you need to know is through the written word. Other people, occasionally, he will give a dream. We see this with Joseph. When he was 17 and he still didn't even understand it. And his dad, who had dreams, didn't bother to explain it. If you go into missions overseas, you are going to see people are inundated with dreams and visions. And miracles and signs and speaking in tongues and things that are so necessary for evangelism in that part of the world, because they don't have the blessings that we have here in America and the freedom, right? They're under oppression through their government or whatever. But we need to know a healthy perspective of the dreams that actually come from God. And that is, if it's truly a dream from God, every one of the dreams that we see recorded in the written scripture are going to give you clues as to whether or not you can identify it's from God. One of the profound things about it is you are perplexed. You are, remember John when he had dreams? I mean, when he's had a vision and God came to him in dreams, he was literally on his knees, pallor gray. He was shaken. He couldn't stand. God touched him to strengthen him and to stand him up. We see this with Daniel as well in the Old Testament with Daniel. I think there's one in Ezekiel, if I remember right. So, I mean, these are things that are going, it's beyond the normal dream. And it's always for the perspective of God's work. God's not telling you how to fatten your bank account, unless it has to do with his ministry, right? So God will speak, and when he speaks, it's for divine purpose. And what do you think the divine purpose was here with the baker and the what do you think was going on there? Why would these two heathen men that worked for the king coming into this prison, why would they have a dream? From God.
They needed to see that Joseph's God could interpret it so then Pharaoh.
Which is exactly what we said. Yes, this is why I said this. Joseph proclaims interpretations belong to God. One of the number one things that needed to be established in this context of the life of Joseph in the environment he was in was that the people around him needed to understand it is God, Yahweh, Elohim, Jehovah, right? The one true God. He is the one who can give interpretations of dreams. No one else. Because how do we know no one else could? Well, when we get to the next chapter, all the magicians. Now, we're going to go and look at Daniel in a minute here, but this is a profound insight into God, which is one of the things that we were supposed to be looking at, the characteristics of God and the attributes of God. This is one of the things we're supposed to be drawing out in our learning here throughout the book of Genesis. Yes, yeah. Oh, I have to go back and a true precept student. I love that. Exactly. Okay. All right. So why is the baker and the cupbearer having a dream? These two insignificant pagan men. Why did God do that? For the purpose of displaying his power and who he is in that environment, number one. Number two, to proclaim and to, what is the right word, how to say this? To display Joseph as God's vessel, his servant. Okay? Exactly, to validate him. Do you remember over here where he says, Pharaoh called for Joseph, but then he gives him all this information. And then Pharaoh said to his servants in verse 38 of chapter 41, then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? So what we are looking at back here in chapter 40 is the foundation laying that God is setting people up to recognize Joseph as the one in whom is a spirit of the divine God. Does that make sense to you now? Okay, good. All right, so it's really interesting how sometimes you read through storylines and you're like, yeah, you know, and you can just move on past. But the profoundness of what God is doing little by little in the life of Joseph, it's very much like what we saw with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, is each little piece of the storyline it teaches us about who our God is, because that's what we're supposed to be learning, and it teaches us about who man is, and we are a mess, right? But in there, he demonstrates how he is working through very frail, very weak vessels called men, women, both men and women, that mankind is weak and frail and sinful, and yet God chooses to still work through him and in him, and he reveals himself to the world in and through the ones who will cooperate with him, so to speak. Okay. All right, 5 to 8, then we see, the similar account of this. This is where I wanted to take you. Let's go to Daniel 2. And I'm going to, do you have that one available that somebody can read that? Can you read that for me, Kristen? I want to start in 20. Just read 20 and 23 to 23. Yeah, you read that, and then I'll have, Susan, you will read 27 and 28. And Carol, can you read 46 to 48? That's Daniel 2. Daniel 2, 46 to 48. And what we're looking at is a parallel to what's going on in the Joseph story to what we see back in Daniel. Now, what have we said on a regular basis in Precept about if your understanding about something is true, what? It will be repeated. Daniel 2.
There is no 46. It only goes to 32.
Oh, did I get the wrong numbers? Okay. All right. Skip it for now. Well, let's see if the.
There's a 46.
Okay, good. All right.
I watch Joel on and up and down.
Oh, good grief. Thank you. Holy moly, I'm going, well, I remember the interpretation starts at verse 45. Okay, go ahead.
So
Daniel 2.
20 to 23. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. For you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter."
Wow. So again, the king had a dream. This was Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel had been called on to go and give interpretation, and he opens it in the same way that Joseph does. Joseph says, let me make this clear. It is God who gives interpretations, right? Daniel does the same thing. He says, Lord, we praise you because you are the one who knows what's in darkness. You are the one who reveals what is the profound things, the hidden things. And you raise up kings. You put kings down. It talks about his sovereignty, but his all-knowingness. Okay. Verse 27 and 28.
Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners were able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while you were on your bed."
Okay. So again, next step is God is going to reveal this. God knew when you were on your bed and in your sleep, this is what God put in your mind. Okay?
Wasn't it was it Daniel or what was it where the magicians or whatever couldn't interpret and he put them to death?
Yeah, this is what we're reading right here.
Like, will tell us the dream. He's like, no, you tell me what I dreamt and also tell me the interpretation, and nobody could do it. So
Nobody could do. This is exactly what we're showing, and what this is doing is again, it's what happens if God repeats basically the same story twice. It's the same thing that God does if He gives you a dream twice. If He gives it to you twice, what? It's affirmed. It will happen, and God will accomplish it. And so when you and I are studying the Word of God and we think we come to sound interpretation, but we're not certain, we're still just a little we're not really clear, look for affirmation in the rest of the Word of God. If you can find something that parallels it, that restates it in maybe a slightly different way, but it's the same point and it's the same context of information that you're attempting to clarify, then you can be assured then that you have your sound interpretation. So what we're doing right now is we're going to Daniel. We're saying, look what happened in the storyline of Joseph with dreams and visions, and how he's giving God glory for the fact that God is the one who's going to reveal these dreams, and that it's God who gives them, and it's God who interprets them, and it's God that will accomplish them. We're seeing the same thing in Daniel. So go on to 46 to 48 and finish that up. You could read all of Daniel chapter 2 and get the full story.
Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon.
Wow. Does that not parallel with what we are? I mean, it's like verbatim. If you hadn't known that storyline, now you've got a confirmation. And by the way, historically, where does Daniel fall in comparison to Genesis? Later, right? After Exodus, after they've been they're exiled off the land, and now this happens later in history. So we see God doing basically the same thing and revealing himself to pagan cultures in the same way. I am the Elohim, the true God. The true God, not your gods, which cannot see, cannot hear, cannot speak. I am the true God. Yeah, love it. Okay. And by the way, in that Daniel passage, it's an uncommon usage of a word for God there, but it says Elah, E-L-A-H, and then Shemayin, S-H-A-M-A-Y-I-N, and it means the true God, the God of heaven. Now, in their case, it's talking about it's in contrast to the deities of Babylon, and how their gods were contained. But this is the God of heaven that is not contained. Okay. All right. So now let's go to 9 to 11. Well, I know.
5 minutes after 10, just let me know.
10 after 10. Okay. Thank you. No, that's good. You're good. All right. So the next one is what? Yeah, 9 to 11. It's very simple. There's just the cupbearer. So this is the cupbearer's dream in 9 to 11, and then in 12 to 15 is the interpretation. Okay. And the interpretation, and what does Joseph say? Yeah, basically he gives him good news. He gives him good news, and then what does he ask?
Keep me in mind.
Yeah, that he be remembered. And that's important in the subject line for what reason? Because he doesn't remember him. Eventually, but not here. Yeah, golly, 2 years. By then I would have forgotten, right? Okay, now in 17.
He didn't have to remember very long, because he said within 3 more days this is going to happen. It's not like he had to remember that this interpretation happened 2 years ago. Like it literally just happened.
Okay, all right, so then we get in 16 and 17, the baker's dream. And 18 and 19, Joseph gives interpretation. Not good news. Okay, interpretation. So that word interpretation became a key word that you should have marked, right? Now, did anybody get any kind of commentary work done on this segment of the passage? About what was going on? Why were they there for that long? What might have happened?
Oh, like what the offense was?
Maybe, or
How they offended?
the amount of, well, let me just read mine. This was out of my commentary, critical and explanatory on the whole Bible. Pharaoh's birthday was a holiday season that was typical in Egypt, celebrated at court and honored by a free pardon to chosen prisoners. Now, we kind of saw that in the New Testament with Jesus, too. They could set someone free at a certain time. This is why they think that maybe they were there for about a year, that they had been put in prison the year prior, and now he was about time to execute them, and one could be freed. Well, one was, and then one wasn't, okay? So doubtless Joseph felt it painful to communicate such dismal tidings to the baker, but he could not help announcing that God had revealed to him that it was for the honor and the true God that he would speak this plainly. In other words, he wouldn't keep it concealed even though it was bad news. So he told the baker that basically he was going to die. Now, this is very interesting. A little note about capital punishment in Egypt at that time in history. Criminals were decapitated and their headless body hung on a tree by the highway until it was devoured by the birds. That was a typical. So that is kind of what the baker dreamed about, the birds eating off the top of his head. And so that's what that kind of ties it together nicely, you know, in a bad way. Okay, now the last piece. So that's basically all I have to say about that part of the story. Do you have any other points?
The only other thing I read is both of them were lifted up. One was lifted up to going back to the Pharaoh, and the other's head was lifted off.
Yeah. So the idea of being lifted up, to me, what I see that interpretation, this is my interpretation, not God's, but is the idea of them being released out of the prison. But one goes to death and one goes back to.
Well, I looked up the phrase if you want to know.
Oh, good.
It's the phrase that's just symbolically is to, when you lift your head, it's symbolically to encourage or validate them. The imagery is of a person with their face down and raising their head to a more confident position. So you lift your head hung in shame and it restores you to your position.
Okay, so restore it. Yeah, but
Basically, kind of what you think.
yeah, which is kind of, yeah, sort of. But for me, it really had to do with the idea that they physically would be freed from their position. They would both be freed, but one for good, not the other for. And what that makes me think of is where Jesus says, where he separates the sheep from the goat, and one is exalted. The sheep at my right hand, they go into eternal glory. The others go into eternal damnation. And so that was kind of the parallel in my little brain.
Is the name of that commentary in your notes?
Yes.
Okay.
Commentary, critical, and explanatory on the whole Bible.
Okay.
Yes. All right, 20 and 23 is our last one for this.
Dreams come true.
Yeah. Joseph interpretations are correct. Yeah, Joseph. I'll just say true, correct, whichever. Yet, what about that cupbearer?
Not remembering.
He does not remember. Does not remember Job's. Now, I had a little note to myself on here. Divine purposes required that Joseph should obtain his deliverance in another way, that God's plan be perfected. Perfected as in brought to its fullness or completion. There was a different divine plan in this. Had this cupbearer remembered Joseph in that moment, his deliverance would not have resulted in the same outcome. Where we're going to move into Genesis 41 now, what we see is when Joseph does get 2 years, yes, you get, and God had not given Pharaoh that dream yet, and God was not ready to bring famine on the land yet. What did you learn about the idea of God bringing the famine on the land on that day 5? When God does that, what's going on? In homework day 5, 21 and 22 on your homework. What does it say in Haggai, in Isaiah, Deuteronomy?
He brought the drought.
Yes, God brought it. Why?
Well, this particular
Right. But in Haggai, what does he say was the reason he did that? What had Israel been not doing? Yeah. When you neglect the things of God, he has the right to send a drought on the land. That's what you just need to know. When you neglect the things of God. That's in Haggai 1. And then in Haggai 2, what does he say?
I struck you with blight and mildew and hail and all the labors of your hands, and yet you did not turn to me.
Yeah, you dismissed God. So when you dismiss God, when you neglect him again, the first one was neglect, but this is just a dismissal. You know about him, you're aware of him, you just dismiss him. Then he has the right to smote the earth and the work of your hands, by the way. So if you're having smoting in your life, you might pray about that just in case. Any smoting would be a good indication that maybe there's something going on. And in Isaiah 26,
When the earth experiences thy judgments, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness.
isn't that amazing? So what happens when bad things happen? What are people learning according to that passage?
Learn righteousness.
They're learning righteousness. What they learn, how do we learn righteousness when bad things are going on in our lives?
It's our attention.
The issues, cancer, bad marriages, struggles with health,
Really make you
it
go, okay,
There's a need.
all of a sudden
What do I
you
need to
are
do
you
or-
are praying more, you're calling on God for his help, you're seeking God in his word, you are praying more, you are consulting friends who have got wisdom in the word of God and the ways of God. So you learn righteousness. In other words, you fall deeply into the arms of your Savior, the one who is your support, your answer, the healer, the provider, whatever it is that you need. But when your life is good, continually good and pleasant, what? Yeah, you tend to forget.
9/11, everybody turned to God and went to church.
Yeah, right. So 9/11 is a great example of that. It pressed people hard into God. You know, the interesting thing about COVID was, in a way, it did the opposite. But why is that, do you think?
We're so isolated.
We were isolated and we became complacent, right? We became lazy. We also were so brainwashed by the things that the media and the supposed experts about COVID were teaching, that they literally convinced us to be fearful.
To be fearful.
Yes, and to run away. So sometimes the world is successful in their attacks on us, but what should those kinds of difficulties do? For other people like us, obviously, those of us here, what did COVID do for us? It pressed us in harder to God. We turned and our hunger for God. I mean, I was all over the internet looking for anything to, get my feeding from. So
That, but there was way less fear.
way less fear when you're pressing into God, because the fear gets removed. We had a lesson yesterday.
If you died, it would be like, well, it's still
Right.
because I know where I'm going, so
It's okay.
I don't really need to just, I'm not lifting doorknobs,
Right.
I'm just going to continue my life.
So again, when judgments by God come on the earth, or when just difficulties, whether they're a judgment or not, when bad things are happening in our lives, what do? We press into God, and by it we learn righteousness. Okay. All right. So now let's go on. Let's do a theme then for this. We need a title for chapter 1.
Joseph interprets dreams correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Cupbearer and baker dreams.
Okay. And you can say correctly. And then, but the cupbearer forgets him. Okay, so that lays the foundation then for the next chapter, And we're going to go into this. Now, let me tell you what I did, and this is why I'm not so worried about our time. I'm going to surprise you. I was really a little frustrated with chapter 41 because there was paragraph. There were so many, right? Okay, let me show you something that I did that I think, yes, there you go. Here's what I did, guys. I ended up with 3 very large paragraphs, okay? And what I did was I do have down shorter into smaller paragraph titles if you want them. They're written on my observation worksheet so I can read them and follow along easily. For the sake of clarifying and simplifying this chapter, I just grouped them into 3 paragraphs. And then what I did on my observation worksheet, do you see the blue line? I used a blue line on all the chapters that were my first paragraph. Then I changed the color to orange for my second. And then for my last paragraph, I went to yellow. And that is the way I did it. And it's just a little tip that might help some of you who are looking at that and being overwhelmed because it's so much stuff.
I started that way with like, oh, there's so many. Then I'm like, wait a minute, what is the point of this chapter?
Yeah, exactly.
Into the nuance of these,
Very
these like
good.
all this years.
Yes.
It's not important. I mean,
Yeah.
it is, but it's just.
It is, but it's the details,
It's like
right?
the end is what's kind of important. Like the interpretation is where the. Right.
Your title is what's important in the end, right?
Nobody's gonna ever finish. What was Pharaoh's dream exactly?
Right.
It was cows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, did you see my cattle? I did draw cattle.
Little cow face.
Aw, that's sweet.
Oh,
So I did cows and I did corn and, just on my page next to where the dreams were first introduced. I had done the same over here with the cupbearers. I got little baskets on his head, and down here he's got his little grapes in his hands. And, just those are my little fun things I get to do. I like doing the artwork because it helps me. Because I can flip through my pages real quickly and I see exactly where things are on my page. Beyond that, it's big puffy clouds. Oh, I got another one at the end of 41 where they're storing up their grain here. Can they see that on?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. All right, so those just are helpful little ways for me. And for those of you who are artistic enough, and if you're not artistic, here's a trick. You can do copy and paste from clip art on your Word document. Just copy and paste it. And then you can make it bigger or smaller, and then just lay your paper up on the screen and trace it. And then color them in. That's how I do it. I am not an artist. My daughter would freehand it. I put it up.
Susan in the evening class just freehands.
Yeah.
Susan is really good. Yeah, she can do that. But like this one with the wheat and the corn, I freehanded. It's not anything I got offline. That one I could do. I probably could have done the cows, like your little heads, like you did. I could do that too. So fun. But I wanted to actually have a visual on my observation worksheets because for me, I can quickly flip through and find the visuals that help me know where am I in the storyline and what's going on. And it's a real quick memory thing. So I wanted to show you that, and I wanted to show you how I did this. I just ended up breaking it down by color coding into 3 different colors, 3 paragraphs, and then I did the same thing on my observation worksheets, just coloring, using a color of your choice to mark all the verses, and as long as I'm in the same color, I know I'm in the same first paragraph, okay? And that first paragraph is a doozy. It's very, very long. So if you have to title that first paragraph, and that's what we're going to do up here. I'm just going to give you the big paragraph. We're not going to go through all the little ones. We're going to talk about it. But 1 to 32, on the whole, what is Genesis 41 about?
Number 32 is Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph interprets.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said. My title exactly. So therefore, if 2 people say it's so, maybe. Okay, now that just simplified everything so much for you. But let's go through and talk about what do we see in the subpoints of 41. So in 1 to 7, we see that there's this dream that comes, right? It happens at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. So now we know a dream, again, has 2 possible choices. It's either just a human dream or it's a dream that God has sent. And so we're looking at this dream, but Pharaoh is so disturbed by it that, first of all, he remembers it. He is disturbed enough that it's consuming his time and his energy. He calls in all these men of Egypt in the next paragraph, which is 8 to 13, where the magicians are what? What happens? They cannot interpret it, just like the Daniel story that we just read earlier in chapter 2.
Pharaoh even told them what the dream was.
I know, very interesting. He said, this is what I dreamed, and he tells them, but Nebuchadnezzar said, no, you're not going to fool me. You either know what my dream was or you don't, right?
What I found fascinating about this part that I've never noticed before, so I slow down enough, but it's the same night.
Yeah.
He dreams, it wakes
Goes
him
to
up, he's freaked out, he goes back to sleep, now he has a corn dream, and it's
Uh-huh.
basically
It's the same dream.
And he's like, okay, this is, it
Well,
wasn't like 2 days.
and that is exactly what he says, right? Because when you get into verse 25, now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. And this is what we saw in that day 5's homework, where we look at this. It's God that does these things. He brings the droughts. He's the one that, yes, okay. So we see then in 1 to 7, he has a dream. 8 to 13, the magicians cannot interpret. And then what happened at the end of that?
Then the cupbearer remembers.
Yeah, then Joseph is remembered. Finally, Joseph is remembered after that. And I loved that verse 12. It says, now, a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. In other words, we each had different dreams, and he was able to interpret both of them, and they both came true. Okay? Validation that he wasn't just dreaming something up himself out of his hair, or out of thin air, or out of his own head, but that what he said, first of all, again, he had told them in the previous chapter, God is the one who gives interpretation. So the cupbearer and the baker know God is the one that has told this man our dreams. God gave him the interpretation, and guess what happened? Both dreams came true. Okay, so in 14 to 16, then he assures them God will give interpretation. So he does it again now here in this chapter 41, right? 14 to 16. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me, it is God. God will give Pharaoh favorable answer. In other words, God is going to tell you what your dream was about. So Pharaoh then gives him, so 17 to 24, Pharaoh tells his dream to Joseph. That's what that whole passage is about. Seven cows. And we didn't talk about the number 7, but we've done that in years past. What is the idea of 7? Completeness, right? Perfection. So it comes to fruition. And it's also a holy number. And what it's just saying is that God is the one. It's from God, even though some of it's bad stuff like the drought. But still, it's from God for a good purpose, for a divine purpose. So God's accomplishing something here. Okay, so now we're at 25 to 32. See, I got through that fast. Okay, Joseph interpreted, and what does he say about that again? About what's about to happen?
Now, as for the repeating of the dream,
Uh-huh.
Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about.
Okay. Again, what we're learning here is in this Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph interprets that he's saying the dream is from God, is from God. And this is the one that says he is telling you the dream is from God. He is showing you what he is about to do. And that, what verse was that?
25.
25. Okay, thank you. And the dream is from God. That, where was that one? Yeah. God has told her 25. Okay. Oh, are they both 25? Huh. Okay. Okay, and he is showing you what he is about to do. So this is the dream, this is the interpretation, and the fact that it comes twice, the same dream twice, means what?
The matter is determined by God.
It will happen. God determined it. And will do it. Okay, and that was the very end, verse 32. Thank you. All right. So that's basically all we need to do on that. Now we're at verse 33. 33 takes us to 30, wait a second. 30, hold on. To 49. 33 to 49 is how I broke the next paragraph up. And what is the outcome of that segment there? In orange, if it's on your paper like mine. 33 to 49.
So Joseph makes a proposal on how to survive.
Yes, exactly. And just prior to that, what had happened with Joseph starting in 37 to 45? He gets elevated. So here we see Joseph gets elevated. This is an important part of our storyline. Why? What do we know God is doing in the life of Joseph?
Working on him in positions of authority.
He is. He is. He's positioning him literally to be a savior for Israel specifically, but for everybody, for Egypt, and that's what Pharaoh's interested in. I'm going to say, and that's why he keeps referring that. See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And he says to him at the end, the people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain, but where was it I saw that he said, oh, here it is, in 36. He says, let the food become a reserve for the land, for the 7 years of famine will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. So what Joseph is doing is assuring Pharaoh, Egypt is going to be fine. I've got a plan. This is, and why is it that Pharaoh is so intently listening to this person he just met, basically?
He just told him the interpretation of the dream.
He did. And what was his validation that he could trust that that interpretation was accurate? He had already interpreted the other dreams. So he had the testimony or an eyewitness of an event that had already occurred where he had given a proper interpretation, a correct interpretation, and it happened. And now he gives him this interpretation, and not only that, but once you heard the interpretation, what did you think?
Makes sense.
It absolutely, oh, 3 ears of corn or 3 cows or whatever it was, 7 cows for 7 years, but the 3 part on the first was the baker and the cupbearer, 3 days, had to do with 3 days. So all the symbolisms were there, they all lined up, they all made sense, and now what's very profound in this is that Joseph doesn't just give him interpretation, but he follows it with what? Advice on how to handle the situation. Let me tell you what to do. I've been managing things for a while, King. Let me just tell you, I've managed the prison. I also managed Potiphar's house. Before that, I helped in my father's household. I want you to know, I think I've got a plan here. This is what you should do. He said, because God has told you there's going to be abundance for 7 years, you've got 7 years to plan. It's not going to catch you by surprise. We can build these storehouses and we can stuff them, which, by the way, how abundant was it when the years of abundance came?
Really abundant.
It was overly, to the point of excess. They had so much stuff they didn't even know what to do with it all, right? And so the king has now had his dream interpreted. He has assurance that he can be believed because of what had happened previously. He's now got confidence. He likes what he heard. It makes sense to him. In his spirit, he's affirming, yeah, that makes sense. I think you're right. And then he gets the next step, and Joseph said, talk about a son of his old age, who is old age, meaning wise, mature, discerning. He's got a plan. He has integrity. He did all these things that come oozing out of Joseph right there before the king. And as the king is observing this, then comes this part here where we're into our next paragraph then, right? We're ready for this. Let's title this paragraph though. We see Joseph. What happens to Joseph here?
Elevated to second.
Yep, he's made second to Pharaoh over all Egypt, right? And what? He had a plan. I even kind of like that better than the title I gave it. I put, he stored up food so that Egypt will not perish. He had a plan so that Egypt will not perish. Okay? And now we are ready to go to 50 to 57. We're doing really good in our time.
I wonder after he was made second to Pharaoh if his previous dreams didn't pop back into his head.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, oh, look where I am.
I know.
And there's going to be starving people soon.
Yes, exactly. And also just the confidence that he had to have at this point of that God was actually with him. God had been there all along. It's almost like what Jacob said before he had his name changed to Israel. Remember when he laid down in the night and he had a pillow dream on a rock, and when he woke up, he says, "Oh, God's in this place, and I did not know it." And it's kind of the same thing. Joseph is finally saying, wow, God is actually here. He's been with me all along. I wasn't alone in that prison. I wasn't alone in the Potiphar's house. All that was for design purpose. Have you ever had a time in your life where that's been the case, where you have gone through trials or difficulties or struggles, or things did not work out the way you wanted to, and you were very unhappy in the moment, but later something else happened and you went, oh gosh, I'm so glad God did that. Hindsight is 20/20, but I tell you what's really important in that hindsight is that when you recognize that God was actually gracious, that you turn back and say, God, thank you, and I'm sorry for all the whining and for all the discontent that was in my heart at the time. You were actually taking care of me, and I wasn't even grateful. I wasn't looking for the divine plan in this. I can tell you that, that's kind of where I have come. That's why this morning my attitude kind of changed about everything that's going on here. It's like, okay, God, this is what I'm seeing with Joseph. He had been put in this really bad situation where things didn't look like they were going good, but God was doing something. And I think if we can just turn our attitudes back and say, I know what you're doing, God, but I trust that you've got this handled. I'm going to wait on you. I'm just going to be faithful until you do your thing. Whatever it is you're going to do, I'm just going to be faithful. Or until you just simply close the door and let me know that it's a done deal. But until then, whatever's going on in your lives, if you are struggling and you are uncertain and you're feeling like, what are you doing, God? Or why are you not doing something, God? If that's the way you are feeling, this story is for you. This story of Joseph is so powerful to really change your attitude about bad circumstances and situations that don't look like it's right. You know, I've been struggling forever with these sinus things, and I've been in and out of the hospital forever, and I don't know if it'll ever end, but it's okay. You just keep going. You just say, God, I don't understand it, but you've got a design purpose in it. If the only thing that's going to come out of it is that you get the glory because I stand loving you, worshiping you, thanking you, and not being angry about it, if that alone is enough of a testimony for someone to be encouraged, then I've been your vessel, I've been your tool, and I am very happy to do that. And you know, maybe that's the only, and Paul had that thorn in the side. He carried it forever. He asked the Lord. The very interesting thing to me is he only asked the Lord 3 times. I can't tell you how many times I have asked the Lord. Multiply that times a gazillion. And I mean, almost daily sometimes I'm like, Lord, please take care of this pain in my face. But it's still there. Every day I wake up, it's still there. I don't know why. You just have to keep moving forward. This story tells me there's something good coming. I don't know what it is, but there's something good coming, and God will do something in my life or through me or for me or just, if nothing else, the reward in heaven when I get there for standing, you know, faithful and joyful, right? That's what we're looking for. Joseph did that. He's in every situation. When he was in Potiphar's house, he served him to the point that the house had no need. Potiphar did not think about anything except the food on his table. And that tells you he didn't sit around moping. He didn't sit around complaining. Potiphar would not have put up with that. He would have got someone else to do. Have you ever had a person who's been really, really good at something, but they are so annoying because all they do, they're negative nanny. They bring the grumbling and the complaining every single day. It's like, please just get out of my way. I'll bring in a person who has less qualification to do the job rather than to put up with that, right? I really feel like that is the motto or the calling of the Christian is that God wants us to live joyfully even in spite of our circumstances. That's what the whole book of Philippians is on. Count it all joy, right? All right, so now the last paragraph. It's a shorter one, and it kind of brings it all to a nice little, there are basically 2 points in here. What happened? The famine came. Famine came, and all earth came to Egypt for salvation, right? Meaning food, right? And what is the other thing that happens? Joseph has 2 sons. Now, why is that important in our storyline?
Well, because he is a child of Jacob, and we have the covenant promise, they're all going to be,
Passed on.
descendants and numerous. So you have to have babies if you're going to have numerous descendants.
Okay, so tell me who his 2 sons are. Okay. So M-A-N, spell that for me.
M-A-N-A-S-S-E-H.
Okay, Manasseh. Let's do that one first. Let's do a word study on that because I want to get a little history on him for us because this is going to pull us back now. We're going to do a little jig-jag with our thinking. First of all, we were looking at this context of Joseph and what's going on in his life. Now we're going to pull back and go back to the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob context and the 12 tribes. And we're going to look at Manasseh and Ephraim, and we're going to kind of see where do they fit into that storyline, because that is really one of the most important pieces to this. Because if Joseph had gone to Egypt, remained a slave, never married, never allowed to marry, what would have happened to the bloodline of Joseph? If there's 12 tribes, what happens, right? And Joseph has 2 sons. This is interesting. Okay, so Manasseh is number 45. 19, right? And what does it mean?
Making to forget.
Yep, causing to forget. Now, what does that mean? What does it tell us in the text?
God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household.
Wow, isn't that interesting? All my trouble and all my father's household. Now, I think what you can kind of take a couple of different ways with it. Number one, to just simply say, I've forgotten about them. Do you think he ever just really forgot about them? No. I think what it's talking about is the troubles of what had happened there. Maybe he's even saying in a nuanced way that he had forgiven them because he had forgotten. It's kind of like forgetting. When God forgets our sins, he doesn't really forget. He just puts it aside, right? I mean, God knows all these things eternally. But he's causing him to forget all the bad things, his troubles and what had happened with his brothers. He and his brother Ephraim, though, then what have you learned about Ephraim? Let's get that name up here, and then we'll get some details on there. 𝐓𝐸𝐴𝐴𝐸. Okay. And this is 669. And what does it mean? Double fruit or double portion, right? Okay. Be doubly fruitful or double fruit, right? Okay, so what did you do did you guys do any research on these two tribes? Anything on your work when you did your word studies with them that gave you insight? I have quite a bit. I have like two full pages on these boys. Okay, you know the blessing is going to come, and when the blessing comes, Jacob puts hands on which child? The firstborn only? The firstborn of Joseph? No, he doesn't. He does on both boys. So what does that mean about both boys? They're going to get inheritance in.
Doesn't get anything himself. His sons
There you
get
go. So instead of blessing Joseph, he blesses his sons, but he blesses both of them. That's very interesting. And when he does so, he switches the hands, which means, again, now who gets the primary blessing? The younger one, Ephraim. Okay, so here's I mean, there's a lot in here I could read.
Now we're up to 13.
And now we're up to 13, except, so how does that all work itself out? So here's what I read on that, and this is going to help you a lot to understand. First of all, it says, he and his brother, Manasseh and Ephraim, will inherit. They are substituted for Joseph, and guess who else? Levi. Why Levi? They're the priest, and they don't get a portion in the land. They serve the totality of the nation as their servants, but they don't inherit a land portion, right? They serve at the temple, and they serve the nation. And so that takes you down to 11, and by adding an extra son through Joseph, so Joseph gets a double portion through his sons. And he switches the hands because that's going to make Manasseh it's going to make Ephraim the double portion. Now, the history gets sad as Ephraim goes on, but in this it says double ash heap is also another interpretation. I just want you to know that.
Double what? Ash heap.
Now, that does not make sense right now in history, but when you move on in history with the life of this nation and what they do and how they end up really going against God in so many ways, and the things that they do is the double it's like on the one hand they were given a double portion, but on the end they made it a double ash heap. And that is kind of how it's going to go in their life, in the life of that tribe. Given preference over his brother, Ephraim is, as the first, who was the firstborn brother by Jacob at the blessing, becoming the inheritor of an Israelite tribe. His name is a prediction of the prominence of the tribe that descended from him, Ephraim. So Ephraim and Manasseh then each get a portion. Let me read a little bit more here. Manasseh was the elder brother of Joseph. with his brother Ephraim, substituted for Joseph and Levi in the 12-tribe territorial allocation of the Promised Land. Nothing of Manasseh's personal life is recorded in the Old Testament except the birth of his brother, and it gives his name. Manasseh and Ephraim, Jacob's grandsons, were adopted, I did not know this, adopted by Jacob to be legally his own sons. That's how they were able to inherit.
That makes sense.
And so Joseph got left out because they're his inheritance in his stead, and he does this twisting of the hands. Now they each become an inheritor of a land portion because of the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob covenant in the 12 tribes. But now they become a part of the 12. Joseph is out, Levi is out. These two boys are going to be in. Their descendants become 2 tribes in Israel. The adoption is reminiscent of, and he talks about something. The large tribe descended from Manasseh occupied 2 sections of the land, one in the Transjordan territory of Gilead between the Jabbok and Yarmuk rivers, and the other in the territory north to near Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, including the strategic center of Megiddo and much of the fertile Esdraelon, I can't pronounce that, valley. One of the kings of Judah's son of Hezekiah, the father of Amon, Manasseh, reigned 55 years. For the first 10 years, he was a co-regent with his father, a loyal vassal of Assyria. Another one of the descendants, he introduced pagan worship practices into Judah. He became a legend for evil and cause of judgment on the land. You can read that in 2 Chronicles 33. Indicated that he repented after a period of exile in Assyria. To date, there is no extra biblical evidence on this latter point. The 2 other men named Manasseh are totally irrelevant. Okay, then Ephraim, the name is said to mean double fruit, evidently from the presence of the dual ending. Ephraim was the younger of the 2 brothers. With his brother Manasseh, he was adopted by Jacob, thus becoming the inheritor of an Israelite tribe. Jacob, in blessing Ephraim above Manasseh, was predicting the coming prominence of that tribe described from him. In Jacob's final blessing, he included both grandchildren under the name of Joseph. At the Exodus, the men of war from Ephraim totaled 40,500, but when they mobilized the second time, they were down to 32,500. Joshua was a member of the tribe of Ephraim. I thought that was interesting. Yeah. Succeeded Moses as the leader of the nation. Shechem and Shiloh, both in the territory allotted to the sons of Joseph, became the place of national assemblies and the focus of the people's worship. The leadership of Samuel the prophet further underscored the prominence of Ephraim. Ephraim held such undisputed leadership that Ephraim and Israel were interchangeable as names of the northern kingdom. So now you know what happens. They become part of the northern kingdom. Do you remember all this, Carol, from when we did Kings and Prophets? So they were those northern kingdoms who were worshiping the Baals, and all the bad stuff was happening up there, right? And so that's where Ephraim is going to be a part, not only a part of it, but a leadership role of all that. Unfortunately, the measure of their material blessings was not paralleled by spiritual strength, but rather decline and moral decay. Okay, so that's just a little bit of foreknowledge. We're not there yet. None of that's happened in history yet. But this is where we get these 2 sons and what was going to occur through them eventually. And it's why it's super important that their name, that the fact that these 2 sons are born, what it does is it fulfills the lineage of the inheritance of the 12 tribes. And they don't lose the tribe. Remember we talked about Judah. Why was it important that Tamar did what she did in order to attain an inheritor? Because otherwise the tribe of Judah would have not retained. There would have been no inheritor. And so they would have lost their portion and you would have been down to 11. But God allowed that situation, and he conceived in Tamar's womb by that one encounter that she, by deception, I know, which does, the whole thing, right, it is wrong. And sadly, Tamar should not have had to do that. And technically what Tamar did was terrible. I mean, it was definitely a sin. But it trumped the idea, the concept of the tribe of Judah being lost forever. And therefore, God blessed it, allowed her to conceive not one but two in her womb. She had twins. And therefore, by Tamar's righteous intentions, which was to save the tribe of Judah, then therefore she was more righteous than Judah in that scenario that we looked at.
You think that was really her, to save the tribe of Judah? That was
Well, I think her intent personally was for her to have inheritors because she needs to be provided for in her old age. She may not have seen the God plan, but in her idea, and according to the law that, what was it called? Levirate, they said, the Levirate marriage. That was a custom that was almost a law in the land. It was well known, and it's kind of like the idea of having multiple wives. God didn't like it, but it was there. Well, the Levirate custom, God later incorporated into the law of Moses and made it a part of Israel in order that Israel will never lose one of its tribes, right? So the Levirate rule was there, and she was not being, the covenant vow to her through that first son should have been fulfilled through the second son, and he didn't. And then Judah withheld the third. And so that tribe was going to be lost. And for her personally, I agree with you, Carol. I think she may not have seen the bigger plan in that, but she was looking out for herself and for her own inheritance, right? She needed a future. Maybe, but I think more than that, it was just it's kind of like our women today who get a divorce and they've got 2 kids in tow, or in their case, 2 kids in tow, and nowhere to go. And they're just desperate. They got like, who's going to take care of me? I'm going to die hungry and alone, a widow, and or the one thing the Old Testament talks about a lot is the widows and the orphans, and how that's a really destitute place to be, and that's why it's important for Israel to take care of the widows and orphans. Well, she was a widow indeed, and she had no husband and she had no children. That was the worst place for a woman to be. And so I think that was probably her motive, but it was still righteous. And God saw it as righteous because of what ultimately it meant, which was Judah would have been lost. Okay? All right, so hopefully that helps clear us up there. So we're done with 40 and 41. Now we have 5 minutes to talk about the attributes of God. And what I want to do, you guys don't think I can do it. Oh, ye a little faith. Let me see if I can find okay, first of all, I just want to read this to you, and I'm going to interject some things for you. I have a teaching chart from my Romans study. It's the outline, breaks it down. This is my at-a-glance chart, so to speak. Romans has 2 portions, justification, sanctification. This first segment gives you 5 breakdowns about the subject of sanctification, because you know that Romans is all about doctrines of salvation, right? So the first segment is about sin. The second one's on salvation itself, how you receive salvation. The next one is about the subject of sanctification and what that means as a result of salvation occurring in your life. And then the last one is the sovereignty of God. That's the one we're going to hone in on. So I pulled this out just to help me remember all the things that I had done there. That's where those at-a-glance charts are so awesome, because you can always pull them out later. Okay, so now here's what I want to do is what we see. Oh, 41 should be titled. Thank you. Give me a title. How about Joseph has 2 sons? Let's start with that. That's the most important one. Has 2 sons, and famine, but there is famine, but what? All the earth is saved by Joseph's plan. Or you could just say by Joseph. Now, what does that tell us about Joseph? Yes, he is a type of Christ. And I have a link on my chart that you'll be getting when you receive my teaching chart that's going to take you to an article online that you can read, and it gives you, what was it like, trying to remember how many, hold on a second, let me look. It was a bunch. I've got it here. It's at the last part. 75 comparisons of seeing Joseph as a type of Christ on this one article. 75 points are made. I know. I've got the whole thing written out here. The first part of it is a chart. Then there's some information in it. They've got a nice little lineage chart in this article. It's a really good article. You will like it. So go. I really, really encourage you to take the time, copy it, paste it into your search engine bar on your yes. Either copy and paste from your phone. I don't know how you guys are going to do that, but type it out. Whatever you need to do.
In the email as well.
Good girl. Okay, Kristen is our hero. She will give you a link. Okay, Kristen will send you a link to that typology link online. All you have to do is click on it, and it'll open you up right to that article. It's very lengthy. I copied and pasted what I wanted and left the rest because it was really, really lengthy. But now I have all this awesome. One of them is a list of 75 points of how Joseph is seen as a type of Christ. I love that. And I found this really cool clip art thing where it shows, you guys can't see it here, but on one side it says Joseph, a type of Messiah, and then Christ, our Savior. And it just shows you the typology that is depicted on that particular clip art. Okay. Now I want to do this is go over this part. Now Kay wanted us to go through this massive list on all these different characteristics of who God is, and we know what they are. Omniscience, omnipotent, omnipresent, eternal, immutable, incomprehensible, self-existent, self-sufficient, infinite, transcendent, and then sovereign on the bottom of page 26. So I picked sovereignty because I saw the sovereignty of God being worked out here, and then I went to this passage in Romans 9. I'm going to read you just some excerpts, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of expounding. Hopefully I can do this in about 5 minutes. So if you want to open to Romans 9, we're going to look at starting in verse 8 and read down to 21 first. The first segment then says this, and the reason I picked this is because you are going to be completely familiar with everything in here. Now, having studied Genesis, this passage quotes right out of Genesis storyline so that you're familiar. That is, it is not the children of flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. Oh, that sounds familiar, right? And not only this, but there was Rebekah also. Oh, yeah, I know her. When she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac, for through the twins, though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purposes, according to his choice, would stand. In other words, his sovereignty would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. Now, how would works be equated with that storyline? That it would be an act of works rather than God's will, his sovereignty. How do you think that would happen in that choosing of the two boys? What did we determine made God choose Joseph over Esau, or Jacob over Esau? That's right, their heart. I'm in 11 of Romans 9. Okay, so he says, though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works. Now, let me explain that. In other words, the firstborn by man's reasoning should have been the one to get it. And God is calling that a work. He's saying, you don't get, because it's your decision, your thinking, your reasoning, that's a work. It isn't about your thinking, your reasoning, or your decision. It is my decision. I am the sovereign. I look at these two boys while they were still in the womb. I know the one that will be faithful. I know the one who will not. And therefore, my sovereign choice will stand. I choose the one who will follow me. And that's what God is simply saying. Esau should have inherited, but Esau was not devoted to God. We know that. Okay, so we don't have to even go back and look at any of that. We know that storyline so well. Isn't that fun to be able to read a passage now and just go, I got it, I got it, I got it. Yeah. Okay, verse 12, he said, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? Is there injustice with God? Was it unjust for God to pick Jacob over Esau? No, it was not. It was his righteous judgment that picked the right boy, right? May it never be, he says. Now in verse 15 to 19, it says this. For he says to Moses, now we've not done Moses, but we know enough about him. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Now, why is that? Who will he have mercy on? And who will he have compassion on? Yeah, again, back to the heart. Because God is just. He's all-knowing. He pierces the heart of man. He is the sovereign over salvation. He looks at the heart of man and he chooses based on his standard. And his standard is, well, we keep going. So then, it does not depend on man who wills or man who runs, but on God who has mercy. In other words, his plan is set. He has a plan. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. What did we just see with the baker and the cupbearer? The baker dies, and he is the Pharaoh in this analogy. God used him to reveal who God is. He's the revealer of dreams. He is the true God. And by giving these dreams to these two men and accomplishing it, one man, yes, he dies, but God is proven to be who God is. And he gets that glory. So he says then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. Now, when it says that he hardens people, why does he harden them? Because they already have a hard heart. He just simply uses what they are and who they are. It's just like what we saw with Judah, just like what we saw with all these other boys. God just uses what they are and accentuates either using their bad character to accomplish something or their good character like Joseph to accomplish something. He just does. It isn't that God is doing it to them. He uses who they are. So he's righteous in doing it. Who will say to me then, why does he still find fault? Who resists his will? God's own character is never violated. He does not violate himself, right? He knows the heart. He uses each man according to righteousness. Then in 20 and 21, he says, on the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? So in this particular segment division, what God is saying, God is sovereign, but why are you questioning it? Don't you know who your God is? Don't you understand how God operates, what he makes his decisions based on? Do you not trust his holiness, his righteousness, his love, his desire that all men be saved and that none perish, no, not one? And yet, some do perish, right? So what does that say? Then God will take that one who will perish, and if he can use him to glorify himself through demonstrating something, he will. But he hasn't made that decision for that person who dies in their sin. He wanted that person to come into salvation. But if they won't, he still can use them. He's the potter. Does he have the right to use them? Absolutely. And it's sovereign and it's righteous. So if you really knew God, you would not dare to do such a thing or consider it necessary. There's a verse in Job 5, 8 to 18, I want you to make a note of it in your scripture there, or on there. Job says, but as for me, I would seek God, and I would place my cause before God. I'm not going to argue with him. He's right if he chooses to bring destruction or hardship or famine or any of those things. He has the right to do that. I know who my God is, and I'll place my cause before God. I'm not going to go against God. I'm not going to question God. Does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for common use? Now, this is the thing that caught my attention here. God is your creator. He does have the right to do whatever he chooses, but you can trust him to be righteous in his dealings with each individual. That's the bottom line. That's what this exercise was supposed to bring us to understand who God is in the unfolding message of Genesis. That God has the right to do whatever he does do, and the things that we're seeing him do, sometimes we're all going, what is going on here? God is doing these things to accomplish his bigger plan, and along the way, he is very careful and very mindful of every detail of every man's life. Look at how much detail. While he's taking care of Joseph, do you not think his eyes are upon the rest of the earth? Upon every man? What about his father Jacob, who's back in Canaan all these years? Is he not still walking with Jacob as well? Yes. So God does not violate. He in no way ever becomes unholy in order to accomplish something. He remains holy. He remains righteous. He does the right thing. So in Job 5, verses 17 to 19, he says, happy is the man whom God reproves or refines like he did Joseph. So even though Joseph was in this prison, he had the attitude of Job. Happy is the man whom God chooses to put under these kinds of stressful situations and keep them down for a period of time for his glory, for his purpose, his design. The conclusion is that God, who is just and desires that all men be saved, will save those who bow the knee to his plan of salvation, and that plan is Jesus. Jesus is a stumbling stone to the rebellious. He's not a stumbling stone to the ones who have a heart for him. Then he goes into this part of it in 27 to 33. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. Do you guys remember that? Zechariah 9 maybe or something. Anyway, it's in Zechariah where he says 2/3 are cut off, 1/3 will be brought through, refined and purified. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly. And just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of Sabbath had left us a posterity, we would have become like Sodom and would have resembled Gomorrah. And what shall we say then? That Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith? But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. Just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. He who believes in him. Now, who is him? Jesus. And in Genesis, who is him? Who is Jesus in Genesis, starting in chapter 2? The seed. Starts with the seed. And he promises a seed who will crush the head of Satan. And then that seed bloodline is carried. That message of the seed is carried by the righteous. That's what we followed in those first, 5 or 6 chapters. We get to Noah in chapter 6. Then Noah's the only one that survives that flood. He carries it on, and from there, then it goes to the line of Seth, and then it goes into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now we're at Joseph. It is the one who believes in him, that seed, who was promised to come. If you believe, you will not be disappointed. God's judgment is just. Why is he sovereign? Because he's the creator of the earth. It's his plan that's being executed. He can be trusted. He can be trusted. I love it. All right. That did it. I'm 10 minutes over again, but I'm thankful we got through it. Thank you, guys. All right. Love you all. See you next week.